Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025 at looks like 2:51 in the afternoon. We're back to just continuing committee discussion on the CHIP program that is in S-127. So we
Good job enumerating the things that the infrastructure could be used for. And others that I was gonna mention. Talked about, one of the things that was talked about was the reporting, to make sure we get reporting on the housing units that are developed. So I think that everyone was kind of nodding around the table on that. So I thought that seemed reasonable also. So it's that when we get reporting back from TIF, we ask for the number of housing units that are developed and perhaps the expected price and rents and all of that, so that we can understand who is being housed.
Right, so does that mean, so you just want to know the value, what things are being sold as opposed to defining what affordable is?
Yep.
Good.
Is this a,
The numbers change.
is this a good place to put study on applying this to tier two if we decide to take the tier two Act 250 stuff out?
Probably. It would be to have, we could ask Betsy to report back and not necessarily have a full study, but have them report back on what. We could figure that out in that section. Yep.
Maybe, I wonder, I mean, the reporting seems to be about like data points from which we then sort of make an assessment or can evaluate things. Is that's more what you're sort of proposing there seems more subjective. And I wonder if how they'll feel about that unless we frame it in a way that, I'm not sure how we might frame it so that it's not generative of analysis as opposed to data. Do these reports often contain analysis and quote unquote findings and recommendations, or are they mostly just here's what occurred over the last year and now you committees of jurisdiction discuss?
There's a Betsy report on our website from this year. If you look under Jess, and it'll show you what the last report was. I think the last report was 2023.
I think, as far as Betsy goes, we've been encouraging Betsy to provide us with some thoughts of where they think we should go. When we talk about veggie and how veggie is meant for times of high unemployment. And if they have other thoughts on how we can utilize veggie or something similar to that in times of low unemployment that we're in now. And I think, just encouraging, they have a lot of brain power there. And if they could utilize some of that brain power and just having these discussions maybe once a year when they have their retreat. But
All right, great.
I think it's a good thought because they're on the front line. They're going to see what's happening and what changes they could propose to us to make things better administratively and easier for municipalities and sponsors and developers to utilize.
If you look under Betsy on our page, you can see the report, the most recent report. Got a lot of information in it.
I mean, there's a lot of information. I was, as I was looking through what the statute sort of says, it's existing stuff, original value, what was it, now what is it? And I was sort of flipping through, like, oh, are we seeing them make the kind of commentary that the chair was referring to of, and here's improvements or here's tweaks, and that, because I think we'd probably need to have language that empowered them to do that. was sort of what I was just based on what I was hearing from Tony, that we'd have to make sure that we're telling them to tell us, and provide some analysis as opposed to just here's what's going on in the Milton town core. Here's what the original taxable value was, and here's what it is in FY23. And there's just something I was thinking about.
So I have a lot of confidence in Betsy around, providing us recommendations and analysis and that kind of stuff. My only concern about, the proposal that we had there is, I think the obstacles, if you were, aren't with folks outside this building, they're more inside the building. And if we, just had a report, a couple of years or something, I'm not sure that changes the dynamic in the building and we'd be in the same spot we're in right now. Maybe I'm misreading the situation, but that would be my concern. I'd be more comfortable if we're going to do something that puts that decision in the future. I'd be more amenable to having something and say, well, okay, it's this particular thing around tier 2, it's defined in subdivision 2. And say something like, well, that, everything else takes effect this date, and that one doesn't take effect for that kind of thing. Now, that might not change our current dynamics. I don't know. So I don't know how to reconcile, those two things.
Is there a different group than Betsy that would be able, recognizing that probably one of the biggest obstacles we have is around, people's concern about the use of tier 2 property, not developing it as, according to environmental principles stuff. Is there a different group, planning commissions or some other group that could be charged with sort of thinking about that, doing some research and gathering the data so that at the end of that, we could then have something to come back and say, look, this organization, this whatever, has done a study and concluded that
So
we won't get sprawl.
at that point, Samantha Sheehan, I think her name is. I was very impressed with some of the stuff she came up with around Grand List, growth or negative growth at Grand List. But again, I don't know if that changes the dynamic here. If we're saying, okay, Vermont League of Citizens Towns that already supports this, do a study or I'm not sure how much that advances. It's a question. I really just don't know.
We heard from VCRD on this, because if we haven't, there might be an entity that would be the Vermont Council on Rural Development.
Makes sense.
I don't think we've heard from them about this, and they may not want to have to do more work, but I'm just, that might be an entity, to answer your question, that hasn't, like as Herb pointed out, weighed in favor as others have.
Could be an area that you ask them to take a look at.
So we're talking about tier 2. Yeah, so what about the idea of having some kind of like tier 2 is allowed if it's a clustered, I don't know what that definition would be. But maybe you're saying maybe there's a definition out there, legal definition, I don't know, but like you could do it in tier 2 if it is at least X number of units,
Density.
there's a dense, there's 5 units or whatever in a certain number in 2 acres. I don't know what it is. It seems to me what we think about tier 2 is tier 1A and tier 1B properties are going to become more valuable. And then the land will just outside of them may be a little less expensive where you could, or in a tier 2 area. And as long as it is there's a clustered development, something like 6 modular homes or manufactured homes could be like a real actual affordable solution for in some little community.
Oh, sure. I'm not adverse to that kind of development. I'm just not. I need to think about it a little more in terms of, and I don't I still don't understand why if that type of development is seen as positive in the public good, why in the same town that's, might have pretty low growth, why less, why more individual or two units? I just don't know how that plays out in terms of how you get more housing to one of these towns. I got to think about that. Frankly, I want to, talk to some of the builders in my community to see, does that work? Maybe it works. But I don't know. I got to think about it.
I talk about money getting back to the ed fund sooner.
So, I mean, I think we laid that concept out this morning. What are your thoughts on? I think it would certainly help Chip if any excess dollars every year go back into the ed fund. But I think we also need to make sure that there are funds there that they could utilize if there's a shortfall in paying, the $3,000 list drops one year for some crazy reason. That there's funds there so you can continue to pay whatever, it's a bond or whoever you're paying back.
And that's all about the sort of financial details, I think. The words du jour, I think, or pencil in. I've heard that
Right.
so many times.
So that-
Pencil out, whatever. So that might be a good thing to do. I would like to run it by someone who knows a little bit more about project development than myself. The only one I can think of who's really been doing those things is David White, but maybe there are others too.
Well, it's more of getting the money back to the ed fund quicker.
Yeah.
So you've already established what
Sure.
how much growth you have and what your payment's gonna be every year. And so your property values, as you continue to build on it, are gonna continue to go up. And so any growth, and so any excess tax revenue that you receive over and above what you need to pay your bond would then flow back into the ed fund as well.
The bond and related costs and all that
Well,
sort of.
that's all wrapped up. That's when everything.
In the bond,
So then
right.
but we should think of a percentage that they should be able to retain of that.
Sure.
money.
Yeah, no, I get
Goes back
that.
to the ed fund.
And that would be the case if it was a municipal, if the municipality is the sponsor, right?
Could be either.
What if,
Yeah.
what if the developer is the sponsor? Does that work for that?
Yeah.
Them too?
Either one.
Either one, yeah, because they're getting, I mean, it's for the improvements. So they get whatever way whatever they're using to pay for the infrastructure, whether it's bonded or if the developer's doing it, they get their money back to pay that off every year. And the excess goes back into the ed fund.
So currently, how it's set up under normal TIF, if you don't bring enough money in, that comes out of the municipality.
Right.
So, and I honestly don't know what happens to the money. I should know this. What happens to the money if too much comes in?
You can spend it for more infrastructure.
More infrastructure. But in this particular case, you really can't because that's already set up. Okay.
Also, should we think about having a period once all the debt is taken where the percentage is adjusted based on the actual, right?
Well,
I guess that's kind of
Well,
a
once
piece
it's-
of, once you
Well,
know,
once a bond, whatever funding mechanism is paid off,
yeah,
then they don't retain anything anymore. Everything goes to the ed fund.
right.
But
I meant once
if
they,
they retained
Yeah.
any money that's escrowed, whatever is remaining in that escrow fund also goes to the ed.
Well, I didn't say it right. What I meant was if you're borrowing money for the infrastructure, you have 4 years to borrow, spend the money, then you develop your housing. But there's a point where you know what your payment is,
Right.
and you also know what your tax is,
Which,
right?
what your property value
Yeah,
is.
yeah. So I guess this
So your
mechanism,
value is gonna
Yeah.
keep going up, as the
Yeah.
more you do.
so this mechanism would actually, you wouldn't have to then reset anything because you either retain 20% of it or whatever, and the
Right.
rest goes back to the
Yeah.
other. Okay. Should it be like up to the maximum amount of the 1 year's worth of bond payments
Well,
or
we're
something
thinking
like
about
that?
that, but over a period of time.
Yeah.
Because you're not gonna, it's,
Yeah.
your value is not gonna drop, so you're not bringing anything.
And you folks refresh my memory to do these annual reports that they do, at least on the standard TIF ones, which are all we have evidence of so far. Do they actually calculate the effect on the ed fund every year and report that annually, or do they just report, dollars taken in, dollars paid out to reduce the loan, dollars kept for the municipality, as opposed to doing any more of an in-depth analysis? Yeah, the ed fund had to forego this much this year, kind of a thing.
So if you're asking about VEPC, they don't do that, but JFO does. JFO does an annual, I think it's annual, the
Every
regular
2 years.
reporting. Every 2 years?
So do they do that in aggregate, or do they do that on a TIF by TIF basis?
No, I think it's an aggregate.
Thank you.
Yep. You can find
It's an
the most
aggregate.
recent one.
So can you help me, we're talking about theoretically or conceptually putting a sort of a density limitation on a project in tier two, right?
Okay.
Well, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, but we were talking. Go ahead.
We don't have to make that suggestion, make the suggestion to remove the tier two, right? Because that's going to come out, whoever wants to take that out is going to take it out.
Well, we're trying to, so let's try to stay on one thought stream at a time. So we moved
Sorry.
on, we moved to, we can come back to the tier two again, but let's finish the report we were talking about of, money going back into the ed fund, if people are comfortable with that concept. And we just develop it.
Is it going to cause more administrative heartburn to do it that way?
That's what we need to find out. I don't know how much, but sure.
Is it, sorry.
I don't have any problem with the concept as long as it doesn't disturb the financials of the project. So,
Well, and I think the only thing that could disturb that is property values go down instead of going up. So that's why we're thinking they are able to retain some of that excess growth after the bond is paid,
sure.
so that they can build a fund that could help take care of payments if they fall short for some reason.
And I'm just telling you, I don't have any problem with that concept. I want to, double check to make sure that it works, for.
Well, we gotta make sure it's gonna work
Yeah,
administratively.
well, that too.
Anything else? Maybe we'll see some language tomorrow, but this is more to give you a heads up of what you're gonna be seeing.
I have
tomorrow.
one more update on that. The limits of the TIF district being able to borrow, what we heard is that 80% and 100% for the ed fund and town doesn't work for folks. And that folks are much more comfortable with what the current numbers are. Which is 70 and 80.
85.
70,
70, 85.
Yeah.
Okay, are we thinking about, what ideas we should talk about or what we would like to see in John's draft?
Is there any reaction to changing those numbers
Oh,
down to 70 to 85 first?
I don't see the need to go from 100 to 85.
So I'll make a statement on that because I think that what was brought up by Doug and you've talked about it, which would be the infrastructure maintenance. Having that 15% may not be a lot, but it also helps for that.
It's better than nothing.
Yeah, and I actually think that that's probably something we probably should keep in there. Is that 85% versus the 100%? I mean, if we're gonna open up the bill, I mean, I wouldn't have a problem keeping it the way that it is, but if you're saying that they want, if in order to get it past the other committees, they want 70, 85.
Well, I mean, we're looking at 85 more in deference to the municipality to make sure that they are able to keep up with any maintenance.
Yeah.
Set of any of the infrastructure that they've taken on or that they're gonna receive and accept.
Is it possible to kind of cordon off the infrastructure funds? So like, I don't know if it's possible to like require that they're in a separate somewhere over there, like, I don't know.
I think that would.
Well, you can tell them that they have to create a reserve fund until bonds paid off, that's paid off, right?
Yeah.
But there may be municipalities that want to put the full amount in and they're comfortable with. So, I mean, if we have a floor and maximum, so you say, a minimum of 85%. Up to 100,
Yeah.
and then you give
Like that.
the municipality the leeway, but I don't know logistically how that can work. And are we creating something that's more administrative problem than not? But that's something we can explore if people are comfortable with that concept. So you leave it up to the municipality of, do they want to retain 15% or 10% or 5%, or do they want full amount going?
They can do that now. I mean, technically, because they have control over the 15%, no matter what. And they can give 15% to the sponsor or put it into a fund. It's the municipality's money, so they can do whatever they want with it.
Yeah, but what we're saying here is that you have to put 100%.
Right.
As it's written.
Right,
Yeah.
but what? Right,
Well, but
But
the
you're-
other thought is that if you go down to 15%, if you tell them that they have to take that 15% and escrow it until the end of, or you can only utilize that 15% for any issues that come up with the infrastructure that's put in, right, for repairs and maintenance.
repairs.
so I personally would not like that. I think, a municipality is gonna put it towards the maintenance if they need to, and if they're not gonna need to, then they'll spend it where they need it in other places. I don't think it needs to be written into legislation. I mean, if we want to do 80 or 70, 85, that's fine. But to stipulate where the 15% goes, it would be much opposed to that. We'd like to throw out as a option to avoid if the concern to bring it down to the 70% is solely to make sure that the ed fund doesn't go backwards. I would much rather do like the original value goes up with the surrounding areas, but that might just be a pain administratively, so. It's the guardrail that I put in for 20.
But it's basically by any of the growth that's over and above is doing the same thing.
Correct. But
Is the thinking about the reduction and the general fund element just because of the era that we're in and we'll need every bit that we can the state will need every bit that it has, given what we may be losing elsewhere.
I mean, I think, going to 70, 85 is more palatable, I think.
I'm just sort of thinking of some of the rationale behind that, what makes it palatable. If it's something like the era that we live in, that's hard to argue against, because that's
Putting 10% more back into the ed fund.
yeah, and
Taking it out.
Yeah. Sort of like shadow boxing. Taking away from the ed fund. And I know that's a prevailing narrative.
10% more that goes into the ed.
Sooner.
They want more money, rather than, the argument to me isn't that you're taking away from the ed fund. The argument is more, we want more into the,
Yes.
Event, yeah.
because the projects that I'm thinking about, they're not gonna happen. I don't want to jump the gun. So we're still on this topic. I'm not sure what to make of it.
I think a lot of there's a lot of, we're talking about a lot of change here. I think a lot of these people are very concerned about it. Anything we can do to alleviate that, I think is a good thing. It doesn't seem like, basically, all we're doing is taking the guidelines we had for TIF and putting it here with those ratios. Towns are used to dealing with that anyway, so I think that's a worthy sacrifice if you.
Last topic that I had.
If it's okay with Tony, it's okay.
Are we talking about this because we want to avoid the narrative that the ed fund is going backwards?
No, I think we're talking about this because
The concern, sorry, because I'm just thinking that if what we're trying to solve is, well, the TIF, it could cause the ed fund to go backwards. I get back to the original taxable value that will go up based on what the increases of the area would be. There's no way that you can say that the ed fund is losing money because it's going up with the rest of the property.
I
It's
think
just not
so.
realizing that.
I'll finish my answer if you want. So the issue is education costs continue to rise, right? Full stop. It's not something you can automate. It's not something that the costs of healthcare, all of the education costs, all the costs associated with people who do the jobs, all of the things continue to rise, right? We fund that based on grand list growth already. Every time we try to grow the grand list and that money doesn't get back to the ed fund quickly, we're shooting ourselves in the foot because we're basing the cost for everyone in the state on this whole value rising. And I get the argument that these developments aren't going to happen, but there is not a lot, but there is some development that is happening, right? There are some houses still being built. We're not getting, so how do we set up a program that encourages bigger developments that will get more housing, that will grow our grand list, right? To the state so that we can fund the things that we need to fund. And so that's the balance that's what we're trying to do.
Politely, I am unpersuaded by the argument. But I get that others are persuaded by the argument. And so I'd rather have, what was it, 85% of something than 100% of nothing. And,
Exactly.
my hope is that there'll be enough cautionary tales of towns that foreclose the possibility that turn their back on growth and then have to say goodbye to their schools. And I think there are examples of that. And I think that can be a very alarming thing. I would rather I wish we could learn through the benefits of something than through the pain of something else. But it feels like that's sort of the trajectory that we're on a bit. But I think so. I feel. I mean, I understand meaty, but it's still. But I understand that is an assessment that many share, and so.
I also just step in with a not for nothing is like for many years, we haven't funded the capital that is needed to manage our buildings, our school buildings specifically. So we're actually just, Ed Fund is like kind of at a deficit, like already. So if we aren't, I think we have to put in those extra little 10-15%.
Right.
Because that needs to get brought up because we haven't funded the big capital projects that we actually need to do.
Just
Now,
to,
are the ed fund and the capital fund that's needed for school infrastructure and repair, are those separate items? Those are separate and different items, aren't they?
No, because you have to pay the bond back. And that flows through the budgets, which are paid for by that property tax.
So
there's not a
Right, so-
separate fund today.
No,
Okay, I thought they were tracked separately. Thank you.
well, they are
They're
tracked separately
they're not
because
sourced separately.
you bond the state bonds or the municipality bond, the school bond pays with bonds, but it's paid for through the ed fund, which is property tax.
To add to something that Jonathan said is that there are towns that are not building and won't build whatever program we put forward. Right? And so we want to put a program forward for the towns that are ready to build. And if we only focus on how do we make every single town use this program, it's not gonna be the thing that makes them do it, right?
That's right.
So I think we want to put something forward that makes sense on lots of different levels.
And that our legislators can champion, can feel good about. I hear that. I agree.
But how do we parse that out? I mean, what do we know? I mean, what's the difference between towns that don't want to use this versus people that do? Because if we're going to zero in on those that are interested, we kind of need to know what they want, what they don't want,
It's the money. It's having to bond for it. And especially looking at our financial landscape now, there's almost a guarantee that you're gonna have to bond for at least a good portion of it. And nobody wants their taxes to go up. It's the bond fight.
So you're saying that's how we know the smaller towns.
Yeah, I mean, it just. It can be hard to argue, I guess.
Well, yeah, and I'm not saying we should, I think it's important that we're gonna customize this bill. We need to know we need to look at what towns want to do this and what they need. And not worry about what the towns are never gonna do this anyway.
Yeah.
And I don't know, if you give me two separate towns I don't know anything about, I have no way of knowing, well, this town wants to build, this town doesn't, I suppose you could pull the town, but are there characteristics of each town? Is it because they've got a low population? Is it,
I mean, I think a piece of it is like, are they doing the planning required? Right? Like, are they to be able to apply for 1A and 1B, or understanding, like I mean, I think that's a piece of it, is the towns that are doing what's required as part of the planning process is a piece of knowing how serious they are, while also understanding some don't have the resources or the scale to do it, and doesn't mean that they're not interested. And RPCs are tasked to help those small towns, right? So, but to a certain degree, if a town will not engage in any kind of planning, that will be hard for them to be able to take advantage of it.
and that to me tells me that supports taking tier 2 out of this bill completely.
Yeah, I would still advocate for trying to have a piece of it to allow some kind of clustered housing in tier two personally.
But then I don't know if it does support taking tier two out, because like you said,
Doesn't
you
mean they're
don't
not
know,
planning.
you don't know what the characteristics of, or that are necessarily driving it. Some of it, like, there are towns in my district that there is actually some, or at least a percolating interest in developing, but they can't see their way out of the dry pot of money. And the municipal, like, administrative heavy load of even just like feeling like the work of weight of having to call to ask for help feels like a lift. But then you also might have some like really small, like, or like your area that's like stuck between a mountain and a river, like it just might not be feasible, and that just sort of might be what it is, and maintaining, you know, those homes and all of that might be the best that we can do there.
I mean, as I was saying to somebody, I said, yeah, so in my situation, there are places that would be in tier two that you could put small controlled
Clusters.
clusters of houses. And that's basically the only way most of my towns are going to have any population expansion.
Yeah.
So I'm in favor of if we could find a way to include tier two with clustered, limited housing, whatever, density, then that would be the.
But then that brings us back to the practical aspect is, can we put together something like you're talking about and still be able to get this bill through this year?
I did find the language in Title 10. And it says the intent, and this is the intent of this subdivision is to encourage the design of clustered subdivisions and development that does not fragment tier two areas or tier three areas. So I think going back to that's the focus, right? That's why tier two is a question for folks, is if we're not going to, if we're going to fund not clustered development, we're no longer following our intended goals.
And yeah, I get it. I understand that provision in the Act 181. I'm also familiar with the provisions in Act 181 that require a pretty rigorous regional planning process. And these future land maps are going to be consistent with the law. And then they're going to be imposed, and they're going to work with the towns to make sure that they're aligned. How about that? So I'm not.
So much insight, thank you.
What's that?
Yeah, got the
I
inside.
just said you gave me so much insight right there. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how it's playing out. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what. I'm willing to think about this cluster and tier two, definitely as a way, to make some progress. But I would just say that I think the bulk of that statute, the real work, aside from tier boundaries, is in the planning process at the regional level and percolating down to the municipal level, which I think is intended to
So it could
be
be,
consistent with, that specific provision now, cluster. So
so it could be in the short run, we say in tier two, there could be clustered housing. But once this planning process is done, right, then it just needs to fit into
yeah,
those plans.
yeah, no,
Fit into the regional plan.
Yeah.
yeah, because yes, that was what I was probably inarticulating.
Yeah, like the short
trying
run and the long
to
run.
say that,
Yeah.
whether that helps us in terms of discussions with other committees, I don't know.
I think it does.
But
I talked to, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
well, I was just going to repeat that, this process that, Tony's familiar with and I'm familiar with is to implement Act 181.
So I talked to Amy or Representative Sheldon after the floor, and she asking her concerns with tier two, and she said the longer term goal of Act 181 is to have statewide, basically the zoning for tier two. She called it conservation zoning, which is basically clustered housing. Right. So she seemed comfortable with the conversation, thinking about tier two and clustered housing. I think she was nervous about this chip being used for unclustered rural development, like
So if we can,
house on 5 acres kind of.
so if we can put in place that create clusters,
Yeah.
there would
And
be,
then fit into the long,
And
and then
fit into the-
ultimately fit into the
Yeah.
regional plan once it's
Yeah.
done.
which I'm curious how much we can use the current zone, like some of the current zoning maps that we have. Especially in some of the rural areas, but I imagine that some of the like really rural agricultural zones are not gonna really change that much with these new maps. How much can we use that in the interim? Guide this.
I mean, it sounds to me like we have a path to include tier two with some proper guardrails.
Right. And if we can keep. If we can identify like what currently is sort of in the generalized tier two. It kind of. Keep it pointed.
And another piece that comes into play is, land trust.
Right. And then there's also the 30 by 30, 50 by 50. What those conservation zones are, which that's still being assessed, and that's gonna be in it, right? And that's gonna have to lay over the regional planning and local planning.
Those are the
plannings.
tier 3 boundaries, right?
Yeah, those are the tier three boundaries, and
And nothing's going on within tier 3.
well, definitely not,
Tier two,
but
yeah, there's a lot of land that's conserved, especially in farming communities, right?
right,
It's like current use land.
right,
Yep, so those are gonna be off limits too.
right.
So, let me show,
So even though they say, the majority of tier two is the majority of your land, but then how much land is actually available in that tier
In
two?
the tier two, and then.
Yeah.
Is
And how much actually even is appropriate for development, like
Mhm.
then.
right, like where,
Actually
yeah,
useful.
where is actually.
I mean, you can have a 10-acre parcel and 9 acres of swamp.
Yeah, exactly, or it's all.
Can I show a little map? This is a draft, future land use, map of a town. And, it's the, but you see the, sort of, what do you call it, turquoise?
Teal?
I think it's turquoise.
Teal with turquoise, yeah.
Under our current zoning, that's rural ag and some housing is allowed. Under the future land use, it would be classified as rural forested, I think. And kind of ambiguous, so the only areas that would, be where housing would be explicitly permitted is being reduced. It used to be, include a lot, you could build in a lot of these areas. And so these regional planning maps are going to reduce that. So when I'm thinking of allowing housing in tier 2 areas, well, it's already been shrunk quite a bit. And maybe it plays out differently in different towns. And, maybe is thinking about some other situations, but, just from what I'm looking at it, there's not much left to build on to begin with. So I'm not sure in terms of ed fund and all that sort of stuff. I don't know what the word is, at least. But again, different towns may be different.
We could offer an amendment on the floor. Just take it out and then offer an amendment on the floor. I'll co-sponsor that amendment with you, and I can probably get about 20 other people to co-sponsor it on the Republican side. And I'm sure you could probably get another 20 people on the Democrat side.
Yeah,
Or
there are issues around, doing floor amendment. It can be hard. I mean, I did something there before on the ed bill, and I much prefer trying to get some sort of negotiated solution to the issue. That's where I'm coming from.
Or we can go with Abby's plan of coming up with some sort of system to do the clustering and show it to the environmental committee and say, what do you think?
Yeah.
Right, before maybe agreeing to that, know that it's something that's acceptable.
Yeah, we could just put it in there.
That to me seems like the logical compromise. And we just do it. And if they don't like it, then
It didn't seem like she.
Yeah, good try.
I think because I mean, as you pointed out, it's actually it's following, I think, what the law says.
Yeah.
In 181.
Right.
And it follows the track of what the planners are doing now. That they are gonna, those areas are gonna be designated for cluster housing anyway. So we're just amplifying that point.
Yeah.
If we allow tier 2 with that, we're just repeating what actually they're gonna have to follow anyway.
I think it makes so much sense.
And importantly, for at least 2 of my towns, it won't look like we're saying, well, the rest of the state can do this, but since you're mostly tier 2, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
It gives them that hope that you were talking about earlier, Herb, and it doesn't slam the door on them. I think I can get behind that. Thank you.
Nice.
Yeah.
I would like to check with my regional planning commission just to make sure that it makes sense to them, because I know they're really interested in having a chip program for these.
Sure.
These. I tried. He was busy.
Anything else?
All that I had. I'm sure I'm missing something,
Yeah.
but that's all that I.
But we'll go, John will be with us tomorrow. He'll have a draft. We'll talk about, I think there's things that this we'll have to add and look through the language and march forward.
Can I just, what's it, Dave? I think. He sent, and I just can't find, I think he sent an email. I don't know if it was to all of us. I think it was.
Yeah.
With a whole series of amendments that I really wasn't able to parse through, and now I can't find the darn thing.
That's right.
So I wasn't able to think about, I wasn't able to identify, wheat from the chaff there. But at some point, it might be good to go through that list.
Well, I think probably tomorrow will be
Okay.
time when we're with John to
Okay.
look at
Yeah.
that and John can help us understand.
Right.
Probably more for us than you, understand what David's asking for. Is that something that we can accommodate or not?
Yeah, some of them were just, I think, clarifying issues, but some of them I didn't totally understand.
Yeah. Anything else?
Do you want to revisit that list of allowable improvements? We never really.
Let's go through the list when John
Okay.
brings it and we can
That
talk
makes
about
sense.
what's there and what's not there, because
Okay.
there's not time to get more information to him. And so he'll, if we've missed some things, we'll add them back in.
That sounds good.
So I just went back on the whole return of the increment to the ed fund is also that kind of goes back to the town anyway. Because it goes back to the school, it goes back to education, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't know.
Just not to leave it for tomorrow. Before this morning, I had come with a, kind of an amendment to at least think about, put a marker in place. The original proposal took advantage of these of increment financing for the housing construction itself. And somewhere along the way that got taken out. And I wouldn't mind seeing some mechanism to keep that issue alive. At least not to implement it, but have someone come back to us and see what the ins and outs, especially after, we have a little experience with the infrastructure piece. And whether it makes sense to expand it to, because again, originally, I think the program included housing construction.
Well,
Got
would
limited.
allow for for the TIF chip, arc, yeah,
Whatever.
whatever it was, to pay for construction costs as
Right.
well.
And just a marker in maybe a couple of years or something to revisit the issue. Or whenever.
Or you could put something in the report that says, you know, are we moving fast enough?
Yeah.
What, you know,
Yeah, the main report, I think, isn't until 35 or something. I'd like to see, this aspect,
well,
thought
maybe in
about.
5 years.
What's that?
Maybe in 5 years, we find out where we are. You know, are we not putting enough money to projects? That type of thing, but. You know, there are a lot of other factors out there right now that are against us. You know, high interest rates.
Yeah. Construction costs.
High construction costs, federal issues, federal money's not coming in. And it may be that in 5 years, all of that stuff is kind of worked itself out and interest rates are down and things are able to move along, construction costs have leveled out. But we've also, we have worker shortages, we don't have enough engineers, so when we're looking at wastewater and water plants and things like that, so how much of that is gonna have an effect too, so there's a lot more than just money. So maybe even if we could put more money to it, it may not move the needle any faster than where it's going.
Yeah,
So there's a lot to look at.
there is a lot to learn. On the other hand, our growth in housing is still pretty flat.
Yeah.
Then we might want to think about, how can we change that?
Yeah, and it's probably not just throwing more money at it, and it's how do we get more engineers in the state? How do we train more people?
Well, how do we also get more
And-
mills online? Like we have to get
So
actually our
we're kind
material
of
costs
like
down
chasing our
too.
tails, is need more young people in the state and we can't get them until we get more housing, but we can't get more housing because we don't have enough people to build it. And that type of stuff too.
Yes.
It's-
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of these would be nice for the young kids.
Yeah. One or two. Most of them to do.
Perhaps an event hall.
Yeah, oh, wow, I'm coming now. Okay.
So, anything else?
I can't hear.
Anybody wants to talk about?
This is just one thing.
So we're back here at 9 tomorrow. Who do we have at 9 tomorrow? Anna Grace?
Boy, who do we have? We have 127 with the treasurer P-check on Zoom and John
That's what we didn't talk.
Gus
and
Seeley.
Gus.
So we're gonna have the treasurer, then we'll have Gus. Yeah, I think he chatted with us a little bit today. He may have some views and thoughts, and then we'll be talking with John. Okay, you have Sophie tomorrow?
Yeah, we got you, 117.
Wasn't hijacked from us.
By tooth and nail.
Okay, so